Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Well, as the Obama administration had promised, they decided to let us have a government that was going to be transparent. But none could ever imagine that it was going to become as transparent as we're beginning to see here this day and age. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is author of a best-selling book simply titled Confessions of an Economic Hitman. He's also author of the newest book, Hoodwinked. He's joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today to talk with us about what an economic hitman does and why he's decided to change his life to actually serve the world rather than serve the world empire, as it's called. And I'd like to welcome to our program today our guest, Mr. John Perkins. John Perkins, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
It's my pleasure to be with you today. Thank you.
You know, I'm sure the number one question that people always must be asking you as you're out there is, how is it that you got into a life that they said you could never get out of, and then you expose this life on such a scale that, as I understand, that you're almost required reading in colleges now?
Well, yes, I got into it because while I was in business school in Boston in the late 60s, I was recruited by the National Security Agency and eventually my official title was Chief Economist for Charles P. Main, a major consulting firm in Boston. But what I really did was serve as an economic man. And, nothing I did as an economic hitman was illegal. We can talk more about specifically what I did later. But, so they told me I couldn't get out. And, in fact, I couldn't get out. The only way I could get out was if I didn't talk about what I'd done. In the early 80s, after I quit, I started to write a book. I started to break my agreement, although it was never an official agreement, not to talk about it, by starting to write a book. I contacted other economic hitmen and jackals. They're the people who come in if we economic hitmen fail, and they do illegal things. They overthrow governments or assassinate them. And as a result, I got anonymous phone calls, threats to me and my daughter, who was very young, born in 82. Our lives were threatened. My wife's life was threatened. I also got offered what's called a legal bribe. Stone & Webster, a big consulting firm, offered me $500,000 if they could use my resume. Basically said I wouldn't have to do any work, but just use my resume, and I couldn't write the book. I took the bribe. I put the money to some good uses, started nonprofits that are doing really good things in the world today, but I didn't write the book. And then after 9/11, I decided I had to write the book. And this time I decided I wouldn't tell anybody I was doing it. Even my wife and daughter didn't know what I was writing until it got out there in the hands of major publishing houses, the whole manuscript, totally written, not a proposal, the whole manuscript, all the details. At that point, it really became my best insurance policy, because any good jackal knows that if something happened to me then, or now for that matter, I would sell a lot more copies of the book, and people who normally wouldn't buy it would buy it. It's sold over 1 million copies now. It's in, I think, 30 languages or more, so it's doing very well. But if someone were to kill me at this point, it would even take off in a much larger level.
Now, it's really fascinating because I first became, exposed to, the kind of work you did, or at least the scale of the work that you do, through a documentary called Life in Debt, and it's about Jamaica and how we actually went in there and did exactly what it is that you do. Could you go ahead and describe for our listeners what exactly an economic hitman does?
Well, yeah, I think it's fair to say that we have created the world's first truly global empire. And it's an empire that's created for the first time in history primarily without the military, through economic hitmen. And we work many different ways, but the most common is that we will identify a third world country with resources our corporations covet, like oil, or in the case of Jamaica, bauxite and cheap labor. And then we'll arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. However, the money doesn't actually go to that country. Instead, it goes to our own corporations to build infrastructure projects in that country, huge projects, power plants, massive industrial parks, highways, ports, things that benefit a few wealthy families in that country, as well as our corporations, but don't help the majority of the people. They're too poor to buy electricity. They don't use the ports or the highways. They don't get jobs in industrial parks because industrial parks don't hire many people. But they're left holding a huge debt. The country's debt, and the country can never repay this debt. And so at some point we go back in and we say, hey, you can't pay your debt, so give us a pound of flesh. Sell your bauxite or your oil or whatever resource to our corporations real cheap. Don't require any environmental restrictions or social restrictions, or allow us to build a military base on your soil, or vote with us in the next United Nations vote, something along those lines. And when we fail, and I talk in my books about how I failed with Jaime Roldos, the democratically elected president of Ecuador, and Omar Torrijos of Panama, when we fail, the jackals go in. And these are people who either overthrow governments or assassinate their leaders. Both Roldos and Torrijos were assassinated because I and other economic hitmen failed to corrupt them, failed to bring them around to get them to accept these loans.
Mm-hmm. You know, and it's really fascinating, too, because as I was watching the documentary that I just mentioned earlier, I thought to myself, you know, it doesn't make any sense. Well, it does from the perspective of the people giving the loans, but, you know, here you go into this country, they're asking more for a long-term solution, and, in fact, what's happening is they're giving them a short-term solution that benefits them, and I thought, geez, this is kind of like creating slavery, and then I started thinking about our own United States, and it isn't really too much different here, it seems like.
Yeah, I mean, it's getting worse here. And in a way, I think we can say what goes around comes around, and the economic hitmen have really come home to roost in the United States. And you know, I think in a way, we the people have to take responsibility for this, because for many years we've accepted this system, even though maybe we didn't really understand it. But I think we did know. Anybody who paid any attention to the underlying news knew that cheap T-shirts and sweatpants and tennis shoes come as a result of essentially slave labor in sweatshops in Indonesia and Nicaragua and other places. And we always complained when the price of oil went up, and yet we had to take responsibility for the fact that we're getting very inexpensive oil while destroying the Amazon or the deserts of the Middle East or now our own Gulf of Mexico. And this was all because the economic hitmen were so successful. And as a result, you know, it's come home to roost, and we put up with it in other countries, and now we're having to put up with it here. But we don't have to put up with it. We need to change the system, which is what I write about now in my most recent book, Hoodwinked, and lecture about constantly. I'm on constant speaking circuit, talking about how we must change the system. We must. You know, I think it's fair to say, Joy, that our country has been stolen. In fact, the whole world's been stolen by robber barons. We need to get it back.
I know it's really fascinating how back in the day, you know, we kind of celebrated these people that were coming in, and then as I started getting older and I started kind of taking a look at things, for instance, there is a book out there called The Robber Barons, and I thought, why are these guys being paraded so much when all they did was exploit natural resources, enjoy the highs of being super filthy rich while controlling everybody else? And I thought, there's nothing passionate or wonderful about that. And then as you see, for instance, in your story unfold, you began to really just become enchanted with South America, especially, and the people down there. Go ahead and describe, because I know that really started tugging at your heart and made you decide, you know, I want to get out of this racket. This just isn't working for me. It isn't working for my soul, for instance.
Right. I think I was lucky in a way that after I was recruited by the National Security Agency, I went in the Peace Corps, and that was, in a way, that was to train me for being an economic hitman, but it did something else in the long run. I spent 3 years living in the Amazon and the Andes with indigenous people, very poor people, people who were being exploited by this system, whose lands were being destroyed by oil companies and other such things. And so I became an economic hitman, and it seemed as though ostensibly what I was doing was right. Business schools teach us that if you invest large amounts of money into infrastructure in countries, the economies grow. And in fact, statistically, you can show they do. But what the statistics don't show is that most of the people are outside that economy, that only the very wealthy families really gain from that kind of economic growth. The rest of the people are using barter systems or selling in local markets that never get recorded. And so what we were actually doing was creating a larger gap between rich and poor, making the rich more powerful, the poor less powerful. And I began to see that over time. But I think I saw that over time because I had lived it with the poor people. And so other economic hitmen, other people with similar jobs to mine, who had not had that experience that I had, much easier not to, to turn a blind eye on it. So in other words, my time in Latin America as a Peace Corps volunteer, and then going back and working with people like Torrijos and Roldos, who ultimately were assassinated, but really stood up to the system, I began to appreciate how ruthless the system was, how terrible it was, and how it was not accomplishing at all what the World Bank, for example, said it was there to accomplish, which was getting rid of poverty. They were doing exactly the opposite. They were making poverty worse and creating, huge pockets of extremely impoverished people who would do anything to make a buck, including work in sweatshops for our corporations. Hello?
Well, just had a slight technical difficulty there. Hold on just a minute. We're joined here with John Perkins, author of the book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Now, John, how are you able to, or what changes are you making now, besides going out and lecturing this, that are actually going to change the way people do things?
Well, I founded or co-founded a couple of nonprofits. People can go online and look at dreamchange.org and Pachamama, PACHAMAMA.org, and see nonprofits that I co-founded and continue to serve on the boards and am an active member. Pachamama Alliance, for example, sends about $2 million a year down to Latin America to help indigenous people preserve their lands, fight oil companies, and do other things to preserve their lands. So I get involved in programs like that, but I actually see that my most important job is to write books. Since Confessions, I've had 2 books come out, The Secret History of the American Empire, and the most recent one, Hoodwinked, talking about what we each can do, all of your listeners, all of us can do and must do to change the system, to turn it around. And I'm on a lecture tour a lot, and I spend a lot of time talking at universities to students in MBA programs, those who will run our businesses in the future. I go to business conferences and speak at those, which sometimes seems a little ironic that they invite me to do this, but many of them do. And so I really see my biggest job is to expose what I see as the truth and offer alternatives, ways that we can make this a better world. I have a 2.5-year-old grandson, and he's a great motivating factor for me to try to do this, because I have to realize that the only way he's going to grow up in a sustainable world, a just world, a peaceful world, is if every child in Ghana and in Ecuador, in Indonesia, in every country on this planet has that same opportunity. We're at a time in history today that's like none other, and we're very interrelated people on this. We're very fragile people on a very tiny planet, really, and we're all going to have to pull together to make this thing work.
Now, I'm kind of curious because you mentioned companies such as Nike, Halliburton, Bechtel. The list is pretty significant. How have these companies actually reacted, or have they reacted to your book coming out as well as the lecture tours that you go do?
Well, it's across the board. The ones that you just mentioned have reacted quite poorly. In fact, Bechtel, after Confessions came out, sent me and my publisher a letter basically setting us up for a lawsuit. They told us that if we didn't drop their name from the book or drop certain chapters and references to them, basically they indicate they were threatening to sue. We came back. I have extensive files. Everything that I write about in Confessions and my other books, I have proof of. I have very extensive files that show that these things actually happened. Mm-hmm. So we sent copies of those files back to Bechtel and let them know that if they didn't lay off us, instead of dropping their name from the next book, we were going to put in an appendix talking about.
That's the way to do it. You want to scream at me? Well, I got something to scream at you a little bit louder.
Right. So they went away, and we had a couple of experiences with other companies. Uh-huh. But I will say that a number of big business conferences have also invited me to speak. One was a group of CEOs and CFOs of corporations that do a lot of heavy mining and mineral extraction in Latin America. These are mainly Canadian corporations. The U.S. controls kind of the oil, the U.S. and some of the European countries, the oil exploitation exploitation in Latin America, but the Canadians control a lot of the other mineral. And I was invited to a major conference to be their keynote speaker, and I asked them, why would you want a guy who's written a book like these to come and be your speaker? And they said, well, we understand that there's been a revolution in Latin America, which there has. 10 countries have voted in presidents that are saying no more exploitation by corporations. And they said, we understand that this is going on and we can no longer work the way we used to. We want you to come in and help us understand how we can do a better job, because we still want those minerals.
Right.
And we need to know what it's going to take for us to work with these new regimes, with these new democracies, and still be able to extract minerals. So that's been very interesting for me.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, too, John, is when Noriega was basically grabbed and thrown into the Miami jail, me personally, as I was watching the news, to me personally, without really knowing all of everything, I just felt the whole thing stunk. It just didn't make sense. And you talk about the possibility of why everything had happened. It was about the Bush administration wanting the Panama Canal back, wanting ownership, which is something that the Panamanians were saying, no, we want to keep our land, we want to have ownership of this canal. And I know, as I was reading in your book, The Secret of the American Empire, you actually talk about the possibility of why he was basically pulled out of Panama and thrown in jail. Yeah,
it was a despicable moment in American history, U.S. history. Noriega was not the nicest character in the world. Torrijos, who was assassinated, who I knew quite well personally, was an amazing man. But he was ultimately replaced by Noriega, who was not such an, I never liked Noriega particularly personally. And there's no question that it's on the record now. It's been from congressional hearings that he received a lot of money in the millions from the CIA for helping to destroy, for helping to expose some of the Colombian drug cartels. But he did not play the game that the CIA wanted him to play. That was obvious. But the real question was, why in 1989 did we send in the troops, bomb Panama City, firebomb it, kill anywhere from 2,000 to 6,000 innocent civilians? The Panamanians say 6,000, we say 2,000. Why did we do that? We could have taken out this man much more easily than that, and then put him in essentially solitary confinement, and now he's been moved to France. And there was never any real explanation to that in my mind. And then when I started checking around and writing the books, I kept hearing in Panama, I go to Panama fairly frequently, the rumors, and I heard it in the United States too, that Noriega there's this island called Contadora Island off Panama, which for years has been used as a place where businessmen and politicians, a lot of them from the United States, are taken, where they can have drugs, sex, rock and roll, whatever they want, and nobody will talk about it. But the rumor was that Noriega had cameras set up on this island and had pictures, including pictures of the second President, George Bush, and that during his father's time, the first President, George Bush, Noriega shared these pictures with the father, as well as a number of other pictures of top U.S. politicians and business leaders, and used them basically as blackmail to get his way. And so the firebombing and that went on in the city was to destroy the evidence, the pictures. And in fact, the building that housed all the government archives was totally demolished in the firebombing. And a lot of people claim, and this is all hearsay from me, but I've heard it from enough people that I think I believe it, and partly because I don't know of any other explanation that works, that special forces sent people into the debris, the burned out debris, in that city to check to make sure that building that had the archives was totally destroyed, and therefore all the records with it would have been. So I think it's a plausible explanation, and I don't know any other that works. I can't think of any other reason why we would have destroyed that city just to take out one man.
Mm-hmm. Just as you had said, and we were all well aware of, they really didn't have an army, and besides that, they really weren't a threat to the United States, But what's interesting about that, especially this day and age, is that now we have information at our fingertips where we can actually research and find out what the truth is. And you talk about in your book to start reading between the lines when it comes to the news, or reading between the lines when you listen or you watch the news. And quite frankly, if anybody watches the news anymore on regular television, they really don't say much of anything if you really pay attention to it. It's like nobody wants to be liable for whatever truth may spill out, otherwise there's a lawsuit. But the media, is mainly controlled by corporations, and they play a big role in how we perceive what we're doing out there in the world, but yet you step outside of the United States, and their perception is much different.
Absolutely, Joy. It always amazes me how I speak Spanish fluently. I can walk around the streets of Quito, Ecuador, or La Paz, Bolivia, and talk to essentially illiterate peasants. And they're much more informed about what's going on in their country and the world, what's really going on, than people in the United States with MBAs or PhDs. Mm-hmm. We just don't understand the world, and we're dumbed down intentionally. The media the media is controlled by the big corporations, either through outright ownership or advertising budgets. And the big corporations don't want us to know about these things. But the information's there. You're providing it. There's a lot of going on today in the what I call the alternative media, like your show, mm-hmm. that provides this. The Internet is an amazing means for spreading the word. So it is getting out there, and I'm sensing a very strong change, but in people's attitudes, because the message is beginning to get out there more and more. Mm-hmm. Well, we just need to keep getting it out there increasingly, because I don't think most people in the United States want our country to act the way it has been acting and continues to act. And the media is so good at covering up. We saw it happen in 2009 in Honduras. That was a total the CIA coup that overthrew a democratically elected president in Honduras because Chiquita, Dole, Kraft, Cargill, and Russell Athletic wanted the guy overthrown because he was going to increase minimum wages significantly, which would have hurt them. Right now we're seeing a scam presented to us about what's going on in Iran. The Obama administration has led us to believe that Iran, you cannot negotiate with Iran. But Brazil and Turkey just did a very, very fine negotiation with Iran, struck incredible deals with Iran, which were beneficial to both sides. Iran will negotiate. Our corporations don't want us to negotiate with Iran, and the politicians don't want us to negotiate with Iran.
Mm-hmm. It's really also fascinating. Here we elect a president. It was a landslide, which it was predicted it was going to be from a guest that we had on our program before the elections. And here it is, hope and change that we're supposed to believe in, but really most of us have become really not so disillusioned anymore to the fact that it's business as usual.
Well, I think we have to understand that the President of the United States does not really have a lot of power.
Right.
The big corporations have the power. And, Obama originally said he wasn't going to take money from them, but in the end he had to. And today his economic policy is controlled by Wall Street, by Goldman Sachs, former Goldman Sachs employees and others on Wall Street. His agricultural policy is essentially controlled by Monsanto and the other big agribusinesses, because he did take money from them. And even if you had a president that didn't take money from the corporations, we haven't had one like that for many years, but even if you did, you'd still have to deal with a Congress that's beholden to the big corporations and a media that's beholden to the big corporations. And let's not forget, too, that our presidents are very vulnerable. We saw one, John Kennedy, assassinated by a bullet. We saw Bill Clinton essentially having a character assassination, Monica Lewinsky, which is easy today. You couldn't do that to Kennedy. Everybody knew Kennedy was having lots of affairs with Marilyn Monroe and she Dickinson, and nobody really cared in those days. But today there's so many ways. So Obama's in an extremely vulnerable position. Any president is. And that's why it's so important that we, the people, take control. In fact, we've always had to take control, but change has always come in this country because we, the people, have demanded it. We need to do that again. We've gotten way too lethargic.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's what's good about books like yours. You're going out and doing your lecture tours to show that things are being done, people are making choices, and this is the impact that it's having. And it's easy for us to be lethargic or to be lackadaisical or just plain uncaring about the situation because we say, how can one person make a difference? And this is a story I enjoy really sharing on this line is there's a journalist out of New York, Ann Powers, and I was interviewing her probably about 10 years ago on a book that she had out. And she had made a comment that I didn't get it at the time, but as I thought about it, I thought, that's very powerful. And she says, I shop for all of my clothes at Goodwill.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, that didn't mean much to me at the time, but then I thought, wait a minute, if she's buying used clothes, that means one less person in a sweatshop has to make something.
Exactly.
And there are plenty of used clothes out there, I guess, to buy. Not that I'd probably find myself using used underwear, but the fact is she made a conscious choice. And that's what it is about all of us. You take a look at, our gas crisis situation. Everybody says, oh, we're exploiting all these countries for all this oil. And you're running around, in a Ford Escalade for crying out loud, and you're complaining about what's going on the outside of the world when you're the person contributing to it. And a more interesting story was, it was about a carpet manufacturer that read I think it was called The Ecology of Commerce was the name of the book. When he realized what his business was doing to the earth, he completely changed his habits to the point where he was recycling carpet. He was, not using chemicals anymore, to the point that he was actually able to outbid anybody who was manufacturing carpets, which forced the whole industry to change if they were even going to stay competitive just by doing the right thing.
Yeah, that's the Interface Carpet Company. It's a remarkable story, and he's been a leader in that area. And I think it's so important what you're saying, that, the marketplace essentially is democratic if we choose to make it that. Mm-hmm. These big corporations get away with what they get away with because we support them. And when we stop supporting them, things change. And, for example, we got rid of apartheid in South Africa back when I was in college because we boycotted corporations that supported apartheid. Mm-hmm. And I remember, when I was at Boston University, you couldn't walk beside the Charles River. It stank so badly. There were rivers on fire in Ohio. And we got that all cleaned up. We forced the corporations to do it. We get corporations to hire more women and minorities. We force that on them. And more recently, to get rid of trans fats in food and to get antibiotics out of chickens. We have a tremendous power, and it doesn't take too many of us. Mm-hmm. If all of your listeners, when we get off this phone call, it would send in an email to Nike and say, listen, I'm not buying any more from you until you stop having sweatshops in Indonesia and elsewhere. I don't want you to stop employing Indonesians, but I want you to give them fair wages and decent living conditions and health care and pensions, and I'm not buying from you until you do. It's just your listeners would do that today. Nike would have to change, and that's true across the board, These corporations do listen. They have to listen. They're dependent on us. Our vote in the marketplace, I think, is just as important as, and perhaps more important than, our vote in the voting booth. And so your point about buying from Goodwill and other used clothes stores is an excellent one. That's a really great way to go. And also seek out those companies that are trying to do a good job, to be socially and environmentally responsible. None of them are probably 100% at this point who is, Mm-hmm. But we must support the ones that are trying and let them know that we're supporting them, and let those that aren't trying know why we're not buying from them.
Mm-hmm. Again, it's really fascinating, and we love bringing these up, even though we also like to talk about building wealth, but we like to also be socially responsible as well as environmentally responsible as well, because it doesn't do any good to be rich if you're just going to be causing the suffering of other people, And now, as you've had this book out and as you've been lecturing, it sounds to me, as I've also been reading in The Secret of the American Empire, is that other people in this industry, and even up to IMF, the World Bank, you name it, who have participated in this, they're starting to kind of come out of the closet and say, you know what, this is worth supporting. How's that been?
It's been phenomenal. Frankly, I've been kind of amazed. I was not too long ago. I was in the bookstore at the World Bank in Washington D.C., and they have a shelf there of their most popular books, and Confessions of an Economic Hitman was there. This was probably a year ago. I said not too long ago, probably about a year ago. That was the last time I was in the bookstore, and I spoke to the manager and I said, what's the story here? I'm surprised you're even carrying this book. And he said, my God, we'll carry anything that our people want to buy, and everybody's buying this book. It's been so popular for a very long time now amongst World Bank people. And they come up to me when I'm speaking in Washington, D.C., and tell me how grateful they are that I'm exposing the system, that it needs to be exposed, that it's exactly right. And I'm finding, too, that 5 years ago, when Confessions first came out and I was speaking at MBA programs, Wharton, Stanford, Cornell, the big ones, I always ask to have dinner with 20 to 30 students before I speak, and I ask to hear what they're thinking, what they're all about. And 5 years ago, these students would all tell me that they were in MBA programs because they wanted to get rich and powerful. I mean, that was essentially that was the bottom line.
That's that college culture. There's no doubt about that.
Right. But this year, I'm hearing something very different, and this includes. Wow. I just I was at a huge MBA conference in China. Heard similar things from the Chinese students that they understand that if they want to have kids, and they want their kids to grow up in a world that's livable, what their goal now is to create a socially and environmentally green, just world and sustainable world. So I've seen things change in 5 years, which gives me great cause for hope. Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. I wonder, it kind of makes you wonder what our next presidential election will be like here and how we've really been beginning to stir the pot. We've been doing, of course, programs on 2012, and what we've consistently come across with from that point of view is that we're seeing basically a spiritual revolution, that it's going to be some very interesting times where things will become better. And the beauty about, your books is they not only share what the problem was or is, but that we, each and every one of us, have a role to do something about it. You don't just leave it all up to everybody else. And I think we've gotten complacent, as you mentioned earlier, to where we try to leave it all up to our government to fix all the problems that we initially, as individuals, have sort of created. And I think that makes this all very encouraging more than anything.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think, I before I wrote Confessions, back when I was told not to write these books, and took this bribe, I did write 5 other books on indigenous cultures. I've spent a lot of time with indigenous cultures, elders, teachers, shamans, all over the world, and including with the Mayans, and I lead groups to the Mayans every December with my co-facilitator, Lynn Roberts. And really studying this 2012, and in fact, I'm speaking at the 2012 Tipping Point Conference in Vancouver, and July 23rd to the 27th. And there's such a strong misconception about that prophecy of 2012 as this doomsday prophecy. Mm-hmm. But in fact, all the Mayan teachers and shamans that I've met over the years, and there's a lot, say, no, it's not a doomsday thing at all. It's a thing about entering a time for the potential for transformation, mm-hmm. for human beings to rise to a new level of consciousness, almost to evolve into a new species that's more awake and more conscious of our role in the world. And if we don't do that, then we may be faced with something doomsday, because after all, by definition, at some point we have to be sustainable. You can't keep... Yeah, isn't it? I mean, for us to have a debate, should we be sustainable or not? But a little absurd, isn't it?
It sounds so ridiculous, but there's so much truth in that.
Yeah. And basically, the Mayan prophecies are saying, yes, you've got to become sustainable. Here's your opportunity. 2012 is the tipping point to make that really happen. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very exciting.
It's a simple question, but it's one that I just want to ask. As an economic hitman versus how your life is today, which one do you like most about yourself?
Oh, yes. The obvious answer, yes. I love my life now. I hated it then. Mm-hmm. A professor recently at a university where I was speaking, during questions and answers, stood up and said he was an economics professor. He said, last week my students asked me, he said, my book was required reading in his class. One of my students asked me, he said, this John Perkins guy, he did all these terrible things in the world and so on, but he lived a great life. He flew around the world first class. He stayed in the best hotels, ate in the best restaurants, wined and dined with presidents and beautiful women around the world. I was confessing, why shouldn't I do the same thing? And the professor said, I couldn't answer the question, so I'm asking you. So I said, well, it sounds as though I led the ideal life. I did do all those things that you mentioned, but I also basically survived on Valium and booze. Right. I went to terrible divorce. I was miserable. I went through deep psychiatric psychological sessions with a psychologist. I was miserable. I hated myself. I hated my life. Now I love my life. I'm not flying first class. I'm staying in, cheap motels half the time, but I'm working on doing something beautiful, which is changing the world, making a good world for my grandson and every other child on this planet. And that's truly wonderful, and I feel blessed to be able to do that. And to your listeners, there's nothing more rewarding or more fun than the idea of creating a better world for ourselves and our progeny.
Yes, and obviously, too, if your life is working well, then the next obvious step is to help others to make their lives work well as well.
Right. The good the Buddhist example here, and I don't profess to be a practicing Buddhist, but I do like a lot of the things that Buddhism has to say. The ones who are enlightened and can retire into being a Buddha, spend the rest of their lives in nirvana. Many choose not to come back as what they call bodhisattvas, which is to live as human beings and suffer through all the experiences of being human again so that they can help others come closer to achieving enlightenment and lowering their own suffering. It's a beautiful thought, and whether you believe in that particular aspect of it or not, the fact of the matter is, yes, if you can help others to have a better life and to suffer less, then you're going to take great joy from that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's just also like the Dalai Lama said to you one time in a piece of advice, don't become a Buddhist. We've got plenty of Buddhists.
Exactly, yes. It was at a meeting I had with him in Dharamsala where I had about 30 people in a group that I'd taken to the Himalayas. And, that was his introduction. He said, he welcomed us and then said, I just want to say one thing. Don't be a Buddhist. There wasn't any more Buddhists. Just practice the Buddhist principles of compassion. What a beautiful thing to say, right? I mean, can you imagine the Pope saying that? Don't become a Catholic.
That's hard to say. Well, John Perkins, could you please give out a website for our listeners where they can find out more about where they can get your book, what you're up to, and how they can actually get involved in, again, dreaming a better world?
Yes, I'd love to. johnperkins.org. And I'd really encourage people to subscribe on that site to my newsletter, which doesn't come out too often, once every 2 or 3 weeks, so it won't overwhelm them, but I think it generates a lot of good discussion. And through that website, they can also go to Pachamama.org and DreamChange.org, nonprofits I work with, and see my schedule. I'd love to meet your listeners in the many cities where I'll be speaking in the next months. So, yes, and also I'm on Twitter at economic_hitman.
Fantastic. John Perkins, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. I know we'll be inviting you back, and we hope that you'll definitely accept that invitation.
I certainly will. You're welcome, and thank you for doing all that you're doing on this program. I mean, you're protecting freedom of the press. Thank you.
You betcha. John Perkins on our program today. His book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Also visit him at his website at johnperkins.org and find out how you can find out more about what's going on out there so you can make better, more conscious choices that help improve the lives of other people that you may never meet. But as long as it improves, that's the direction we want to move in. We also encourage you to visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50, and sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter as well. Also, be sure to visit us at our blog where we archive our shows and have great resource information for you and others to use as well. We thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis, and remember, live your day past halfway.